Let me just, I think, just by way of introduction, remind us that we're here to really focus on the need to bridge between nature and culture, not just in an abstract way, but because I think, firstly, we can see that we live in a world with great challenges and crises facing us, and a number of those crises, some that IUCN is most concerned about, the crisis facing biodiversity, the degradation of ecosystems, the climate crisis, but also the degree to which these are all about people, and the loss of opportunities for people are needing new approaches and needing us to take new initiatives, and the reconnection of people and nature and culture is one place to start with that. The fact that we don't do this is really a missed opportunity as well. Communities don't separate nature and culture at ground level, but we can also see that that by not bringing nature and culture together, we really deny access to conservation programs and opportunities to communities, and especially in terms of Indigenous peoples who frequently just do not see the separation that comes from the colonial languages that talk about nature and culture separately. And we live in a world where very small numbers of languages have framed our conservation discourse. So we need to look really to the diversity of cultures and its intersection with the diversity of nature. And my last point is just to really note that there's an enormous opportunity for us in bringing nature and culture together to find really new dynamics. And my experience is mainly focused on the World Heritage Convention, and it was only after 40 years of a 50-year-old convention that we found that the collaboration between organizations focused in what you could call the culture sector and us in dealing with nature conservation was a really brilliant, positive, energetic set of partnerships, and really little brought together in conservation practice over time. We've spent decades sort of separating nature and culture, and it's time to take new approaches. So in this session, I hope we will be able to unpack these issues. We're going to look at the role that heritage specifically plays in looking to better approaches, the concept of biocultural heritage, the concept of cultural landscapes, and how we can better connect social and cultural issues to environmental concerns. And we'll try to ground that in several lines of action, but including research, including action on the ground, including the partnerships that are needed to enable us to go further. And with that, I'm going to hand straight to Christina for 2 or 3 minutes to make a few opening remarks, and then I'll bring us back to some provocative presentations to help start this session. Christina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to co-chair this very important session. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to further elaborate a bit of the background to these issues. So the separation of nature and culture is actually a fairly recent thing, which has occurred only in the last 200 years or so, and has resulted in this creation of separate institutions and policies for the protection of natural and cultural heritage. So strictly protected areas, which exclude people in order to protect nature, first emerged in the 1800s in the US and have become the dominant model for conservation across the world. But they have had some very negative impacts for the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples living in and around protected areas. And many protected areas are also losing biodiversity. The Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is equivalent to the IPCC for climate change, recently found that biodiversity is declining less rapidly on lands managed by Indigenous people than on any other lands. So we really need to return, I think, to the holistic worldviews of Indigenous peoples, where nature and culture, the tangible and intangible, are inextricably linked and cannot be separated. So Indigenous peoples' holistic worldviews and well-being concepts emphasize that people and nature must be in balance to achieve well-being. And this provides alternative paradigms for development, which are sustainable and equitable. Indigenous territories and food systems are really critical for meeting a whole range of SDGs, from food, ending hunger, ending poverty, health and well-being, as well as biodiversity and climate change. So the concept of biocultural heritage is derived from Indigenous peoples' own worldviews and traditions and principles. It emphasizes the inextricable linkages between biodiversity and culture and well-being, and the rights of Indigenous peoples over their cultural and biological heritage. Research by IIED and Asociación Andes in Peru and Indigenous partners identified 5 key components of biocultural heritage, which are interdependent: traditional knowledge, biodiversity, landscapes, cultural and spiritual values, and customary laws. And of course, languages are also a key component. And the government of Mexico has recently enshrined biocultural heritage in law, defining it as comprising the environment, culture, and territories, and characterized by landscapes characterized by heterogeneity, diversity, stability, and resilience. So to conclude, just to emphasize really that safeguarding biocultural heritage and achieving the SDGs requires urgent action to put Indigenous peoples at the center of decision making. Indigenous peoples speak more than 4,000 languages, and about 20 Indigenous languages are lost each year. They also represent 66% of the world's population, but actually make up 19% of the extreme poor, and continue to suffer widespread racial discrimination, marginalization, and human rights violations. So I think any discussion on nature and culture needs to be informed by this background context. Thank you.
So thanks, Christina. And let's just move straight now to 3 provocations. Let's move straight away to Ros Bryce, Senior Research Fellow in the University of the Highlands and Islands in Perth.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk a bit about my research on approaching sort of natural and cultural heritage and integrating these 2 resources for sustainable development. So just a bit about where I'm coming from. So I'm part of an interdisciplinary research team. I'm very focused on sustainable land management. I'm an ecologist by background, so I have a lot of research interests in looking at how we can manage kind of ecosystem services and kind of balance the kind of nature and cultural priorities at the landscape scale. I'm particularly interested in how land ownership and land use decision making affects kind of sustainable outcomes, and also working with communities, has already been said, in kind of trying to inform more sustainable futures. I'm also interested in looking at issues of conflict and polarization that tend to arise at larger landscape scales. So I'm going to talk today about some of the experiences from one of our projects, which is about sustainable ecotourism and implementing new initiatives for greater landscape sustainability, and also looking ahead to some new research we're about to launch with our Cultivate project on cultural narratives at the landscape scale. So I'm going to talk first about some concepts that are very important in our research. So firstly, the idea of socio-ecological systems is one that we are very focused on. So the premise that socio-ecological dynamics and well-being are intrinsically linked with biophysical resources and environmental quality. And it's increasingly important, I think, to understand the cultural dimensions of these systems and understand how that is actually informing change towards making more sustainable transitions. I'm also going to talk a bit about virtuous circles, which is about the idea of trying to create positive reinforcement between the cultural, natural, economic, and social capitals in our landscapes. And to do this, we draw also on the seeds of a good Anthropocene approach, which promotes the idea of a positive discourse for future sustainability, rather than some of the dystopian discussions that we tend to get embroiled in. So these concepts translate directly to practices on the ground, where we are involved with developing partnerships between stakeholders and communities that have different values and approaches towards the integration of nature and culture. We are very focused on community-based bottom-up processes that are really co-productive and therefore involve the buy-in of the community with trying to seek out a sustainable future. And we also are quite focused on promoting learning, both within and between the sustainable landscapes that we're working in. So just to build on the idea of socio-ecological systems, as I said, I think cultural dimensions are hugely important in defining and informing how we can make more sustainable choices when we're trying to conserve landscapes. This paper by Poe et al. I found quite useful to actually bring out some of these core cultural dimensions that are important in these socio-ecological systems. So the idea of biocultural interactions, the way we engage with nature in our landscapes, the importance of local ecological knowledge and practice, and the histories of these, and also livelihood dynamics, so the way communities are structured and the economic dynamics are really important in determining how landscapes are managed. The ideas of meanings and values and identities that both communities and stakeholders, both within and out with our landscapes, and how they attach these values to natural resources. And also important is the idea of governance and access. How can communities and residents actually get involved in managing landscapes and feel empowered to take decisions and instigate behavioral changes that can actually make a difference? So I think these cultural dimensions, it's quite useful to think about them alongside the kind of the economic and the social and the natural capital resources that we might be a bit more familiar with. So I found it quite useful to think about these in terms of virtuous circles. So I've put in a diagram from this paper by Selman at Night, which is quite a useful commentary on the topic. And it really kind of shows how you can create more positive reinforcement between these different kind of landscape capitals. So it kind of starts from the premise that cultural landscapes are quite prone to a loss of biodiversity, a kind of vicious cycle almost of a loss of environmental quality and a decline in communities and community circles. And they argue in this paper that landscape planning should really be working to reinstate the virtuous circles between these different capitals. So you have a kind of a healthier environment, and that leads to kind of more community engagement, new businesses, new ideas, kind of retaining the population. So these kind of positive feedback loops. So I wanted to then mention that we have converged on this concept in our work on the SHAPE project, which, as I said, is about developing new sustainable ecotourism initiatives in practice in biosphere reserves in various European countries. So as part of this project was to work to identify and understand how communities valued both their natural and cultural assets, and then work towards the development of initiatives that would build on these, and not only build on these, but also integrate activities that could actually enhance and improve our natural and cultural heritage in these areas. So one really good example from one of our project partners was the development of the wool heritage route in Nordhordland, which is an area near Bergen in Norway. So they worked to develop a kind of landscape scale tourism initiative that really added value to the traditional product of wool and farming and land management for sheep production. So it linked the retailers, the markets, the food and accommodation providers and farmers. So all quite small businesses that wouldn't perhaps thrive particularly well in the tourism sector on their own. But they worked together to develop products that really kind of showcase the cultural identity of the area and added value to a product that had lost a lot of value kind of over the last few decades. So that's an example of the kinds of initiative that I think is quite useful. And it's important, of course, to do this at the landscape scale when we're thinking about land management practices and associated cultural heritage. To really think about more sustainable futures, we need to kind of think at a reasonably large spatial scale. So to this end, we've been working quite extensively with biosphere reserves and conceptualizing those as sustainable heritage areas. So in the SHAPE project, we work with, I think, 6 or 7 biosphere reserves across Europe. And they're large scale areas with a real ethos of community engagement and bottom up approaches to sustainable development. So they're good places to start to test and to learn and to understand more about new approaches for sustainable development. There's a network of over 700 biosphere reserves across about 130 countries. So there's an opportunity there for good practice knowledge exchange and dissemination as well. So in the SHAPE project, we this landscape scale across the biosphere reserves. We really devoted a lot of time and energy to really doing high quality bottom-up community engagement, where we invited the community to really participate in identifying and eliciting their values for different elements of cultural and natural heritage in the area. And this built up momentum and a kind of culture of participation that then allowed us to identify some much more specific projects to take forward within that project timeframe that we had. But we also left a legacy of the project in terms of a resource bank for the community and new directions that they could follow. And we want to build on this with our new project that's beginning this year, the Cultivate project, which is funded by the Joint Programming Initiative for Cultural Heritage and Global Change, which is about co-creating cultural narratives in European landscapes. Again, working in biospheres and looking at how cultural heritage narratives are responding to major drivers of change, including climate change, land use change, and COVID-19. So I've just shown you that the process we're going to take in that project will be to kind of explore the diversity of cultural heritage narratives, the nuances of how cultural heritage is perceived and articulated by different parts of the community coming from across different landscapes. We're then going to work with communities on a co-creation process to really articulate these narratives and actually then link this to sustainability and sustainable development goals to support cultural heritage in the making and work towards a more sustainable future. So just finally, we're going to, I mentioned Seeds of a Good Anthropocene at the beginning, and this is a kind of a method of incorporating a positive discourse into thinking about sustainable futures, where we kind of collect ideas about initiatives that are related to different kind of landscape contexts and challenges, and make these available kind of more widely to understand how different solutions could be implemented according to different challenges, whether that be in agroecology, in urban areas, or technological innovation looking to the future. So this is just trying to kind of promote a positive discourse into the future. And I'll just finish with the sustainable development goals that we hope to address using some of these approaches. I won't go into these, but we want to obviously inform the targets around cultural and natural heritage, but also influence kind of inclusion, empowerment, and promote participation and awareness raising across the landscapes we're working in. So that was a very quick tour of some of the work we're involved with. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rose. We'll return speedily now to our program and please hold your questions for the end of the session. I'd like to move straight to Alejandro Argumedo, Director of Programs, Andes Amazon Lead in the SWIFT Foundation, and joining us from the Andes, I think. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Right. I don't know if you are seeing my
we can.
Is my screen on?
Yeah, we can see you. The opening slide, I think.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are at lunch. I do hope that everybody is healthy and safe. These are hard times. I'm a Quechua native from Peru, and so my presentation will focus on the experience of my own people. As Cristina has mentioned, this is an indigenous land, and it's part of the 370 million people, indigenous people that inhabit the world, which are only 5% of the total population, but hold 18% of the land. The home areas across 70 countries, from the Arctic to the Pacific South, include many of the world's biodiversity hotspots. But what I would like to underline in this discussion is that for indigenous peoples, all the elements of nature, of the landscape, be it river, forest, crops, rain, sky, stars, animals, etc., are embedded in its corresponding soul. Everything has a spirit and sacredness. This intense relationship with the elements is what makes a significant difference in human relations with nature. It nurtures the great respect that Native people have for other beings and nature. This quality has allowed indigenous peoples to craft long-term landscapes strategies which have proven their adaptability for thousands of years and can provide lessons about environmental stewardship. Also, it offers alternative paradigms of development which are rooted in biocultural heritage. These paradigms are key to produce food sustainability, nurture biodiversity, maintain the integrity of ecosystems and cut emissions while limiting growth on this our finite planet. As an example of this, let me share with you the experience of the Potato Park in Cusco, Peru. It's an indigenous biocultural heritage territory implemented following the principles of the Andean IU. The Andean IU is a traditional landscape organization that seeks to balance the needs and aspirations of people. We call it Runa, nature, we call it Salja, and the sacred, we call it Auki. Those you can see in this graphic. Achieving the balance of summa causae, or buen vivir, is the goal of this IU system. This vision reflects the role that biocultural heritage plays in sustainable development, and it matches up well with modern notions of well-being, which provides a resilient vision of the future. A biocultural heritage landscape is defined as an indigenous territoriality that embodies a dynamic relationship of complementarity, reciprocity, and balance between humans and the natural and sacred dimensions of nature, and connects them across time and space. The Potato Park was established as a biocultural heritage landscape in early 2000 by 6 indigenous communities in the Sacred Valley of the Incas in Cusco, Peru, to celebrate the rich biocultural heritage, especially of native potatoes. The area is a secondary center of foraging of potato and covers almost 10,000 hectares with over 6,000 inhabitants. From its inception, the goal of Summa Causae, or Buen Vivir, provided the initiative with a strong focus on sociocultural, or the sacred, environmental, or the Salja, real, and economic, what humans do, all in terms of the dimensions of the land. The IU approach provided also ways and means to generate benefits coming from different sectors, or these 3 different sectors of the landscape: economic, conservation, governance, policy that favors communities, and a framework for these sectors to strongly influence each other. Let me share examples of some of these benefits that were created by this landscape approach. In the Runa IU, or the realm of humans, this dimension includes all activities that are productive and economic that the communities realize, as well as the management of all the biocultural assets they have, including domesticated plants, animals, water, and rocks. Here, the focus is to strengthen the traditional indigenous agri-food system, which have resulted in more diverse, nutritious, and healthy food. In the last 15 years, the communities have increased food production while creating positive social and environmental impacts. Traditional practices are helping to better manage prevention and eradication of pests, This is supported by the efforts of preservation of traditional structures such as agricultural terraces, irrigation systems. All this contributed to improve food security. Other activities, economical activities of the park are developing new bioculture innovations, including natural products based on biodiversity, and the integration of technological developments to improve the efficiency of the traditional system. People now use the internet, wireless technologies, and renewable energies. These stimulation economical activities have created work through tourism, microenterprises, and a monetary and non-monetary business model, which have promoted the role of women and youth in leadership positions. In the Shanghai youth, the realm of the wild, the dimension that includes activities involving reciprocity and relationality with the land, including nurturing and conservation of domesticated and wild plants and animal biodiversity. One example is that the potato park harbors the highest potato diversity in the world. In the last 15 years, we have increased this diversity to approximately 1,500 varieties of potatoes now. Also, there is a very active conservation of wild relatives. Traditional reciprocity-based nurturing conservation activities have improved soil, water, at the same time reverting the effects of natural hazards like flooding, droughts, wildfires. So this great respect that Quechua people have for other beings has helped the restoration of many of these degraded ecosystem, food pools and habitats that we had. And it's a very good example of how biocultural heritage is about the interconnectedness and linkages between nature and the community. In the sacred realm of the Auki, the activities include the application of customary laws and institutions and the collective collective governance of the potato park. This governance, in the case of the potato park, includes the mountains as decision makers, particularly in matters related to food, medicine, water, and the maintenance of cultural heritage practice. The inclusion of mountains in institutions of human governance also has enhanced greatly the identity of indigenous peoples, offering the communities mechanisms and instruments to manage their more effectively the landscape. Actual research activities have created exchange and co-learning. The Potato Park is a member of the International Network of Mountain Indigenous Peoples. So many that spans all the mountains of the world, and many of those communities have come to the Potato Park to learn and collaborate as a group to replicate this experience in many mountains of the world. Also, the use of customary laws has served to create laws that impacted the whole society, including biopiracy, intellectual property, and GMOs. While all these are examples of successes that Potato Park has achieved, of course, there is also problems, challenges, including conflicts, as would happen in any human community. Well, they derive out of, lone marginalization and vulnerability brought by historical trauma of colonization, the communities also have shown resilience to overcome those by strengthening this linkage with the landscape. And in closing, let me say that I believe the world will be in a better place and will no longer be surprised by all this environmental destruction and climate change and pandemics if we pay more attention to indigenous peoples who maintain, as it was noted, more than 35% of terrestrial areas with very low human impact. In this context, land rights for indigenous peoples and protection for land defenders are urgent. In 2020 alone, a record 212 land and environmental activists and defenders were killed, and land grabbing have increased in spite of COVID-19. These heroes continue to remind us that we are part of nature and cannot survive much longer in a state of capitalist war with a web of life. Thank you.
Alejandro, thank you for a great presentation, and I think it's appropriate also just to take the moment to stand in solidarity with the people that have lost their lives in the struggle to protect their lands and protect culture and nature. So thank you for reminding us of that too. We'll move to our third provocation from Dr. Maya Ishizawa, and the floor is yours again, Maya. Good luck.
Thank you, Tim. Now I think Francesca will share the presentation to avoid any issue with the presentation. Francesca? Yes.
It's not me, it's Eunice, but we will take care of your presentation.
Okay, but I start anyways, or continue, retake what I was saying. So the Panorama Nature Cultural Thematic Community aims to bring together heritage practitioners from the natural and cultural heritage fields to share their management challenges and strategies to learn from each other, generating a community of practice and heritage network at a global level, which goes beyond World Heritage. So Panorama Nature Culture addresses some key issues found at policy, research, and practice in the implementation of the World Heritage Convention and in general in the heritage field. The World Heritage Convention is a unique international legal instrument that brings together concerns about natural and cultural heritage. However, it defines cultural and natural heritage separately in its Articles 1 and 2. In the implementation of the Convention, the World Heritage System and national administrations have followed a nature-culture divide, which does not necessarily exist at local level. Local communities and indigenous people hold diversities of worldviews, where nature as a separate entity is not a norm. This has brought misunderstandings and issues in the application of the World Heritage Convention and heritage practices in places where other than the naturalist ontology are fostered. Hence, policy needs to adapt to local realities and be built with bottom-up collaboration. And for this, we need to collect evidence. Please go back to the first slide. In terms of research and practice, the divide is reflected in the disciplinary and sectorial backgrounds of professionals working in heritage conservation. In order to understand heritage in a more holistic manner, interdisciplinary research and cross-sectoral exchange are necessary. Now you can go back to the first slide, please, second slide. So Panorama Nature Culture addresses these issues by documenting nature culture practices happening on the ground. Can you go further? In order to provide evidence for policymaking towards interconnecting natural and cultural heritage sectors and embed heritage in their larger sustainable development framework. Next slide, please. But what is Panorama? Panorama Solutions for a Healthy Planet is a partnership initiative led by IUCN and GIZ involving 10 organizations. It connects the field of conservation, development, and international cooperation in promoting sustainable development through experiences on the ground with 7 thematic communities. Panorama online platform documents and promotes examples of inspiring, replicable solutions across a range of conservation and sustainable development topics, enabling cross-sectoral learning and inspiration. Panorama allows practitioners to share and reflect on their experience years, how similar challenges can be addressed around the globe. Following the panorama solutioning approach, case studies are documented as solutions using a standard format that identifies replicable building blocks, which are the key success factors and the context in which the solutions were implemented. Solutions are shared on the online platform and through publications. They are also integrated into capacity development activities and workshops. This methodology for learning and innovation is applicable across topics, sectors, and audiences, supporting the upscaling of successful interventions. There are two main users, which are the solution provider that documents and uploads its work, which is then reviewed by experts and peers, convened by the portal hosting organizations, and the solution seeker that accesses the solution and adapts it to its own context. Solution seekers can contact solution providers and exchange further information on their case studies. In this way, a knowledge exchange network is generated based on peer learning. Next slide, please. Panorama Nature Cultural Thematic Community was launched on October 7, 2020 in the marker event of ICOMOS General Assembly. The next slide, please. Yes, thank you. It brings together the three advisory bodies to the World Heritage Convention, ICROM, IUCN, and ICOMOS, as thematic communities where the interlinkages between natural and cultural heritage are highlighted for an inclusive governance and effective integrated management. The portal is also co-hosting solutions from other thematic communities like protected areas, marine and coastal, agriculture and biodiversity, sustainable urban development and resilience, among others. And at the moment, 288 solutions can be accessed through the Panorama Nature Culture portal. To start this thematic community, the World Heritage Leadership Program has curated 20 pilot case studies of heritage places inscribed on the World Heritage List. These showcase examples of processes that involve landscape approaches to heritage management and practices that interconnect nature, culture, and people, linking the protection of cultural and natural values in heritage places. We have published solutions from the rice terraces of the Philippines and the honey terraces in China, which link indigenous and local knowledge to sustainable conservation. Also, urban agriculture in the case of the city of Bamberg in Germany, or the traditional landscape. Other examples are the shared governance model using Cinque Terre coastal landscape in Italy and the traditional management of sacred forests in Kenya and in Japan, among other examples of places where what could be understood as biocultural heritage is sustained. The portal is not only dedicated to World Heritage properties, but it looks at being populated by examples of all types of sites and not necessarily internationally recognized. Next slide, please. Filters or tags allow to summarize the context of the solution, including ecosystems, themes, and challenges, which help the user search and also highlight how the solution addresses international frameworks. In this way, it is also recognized how heritage management contributes to the Agenda 2030 and the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Sendai framework. Next slide, please. In implementing the Panorama Nature Culture Thematic Community, we brought the cultural heritage field to the platform, highlighting the role of culture in sustainable development and the interlinkages between natural and cultural diversity. We identified more than 240 solutions already published in the platform, which had a cultural component that was not acknowledged, showing that culture plays indeed a role in sustainable development endeavors. And we introduced the filters of culture and local actors to acknowledge their role in these interventions. Next slide, please. Some opportunities that this platform provides are documenting actions on the ground, learning by doing, and enabling users and decision makers through the platform. We aim to embed research in site management needs by collecting experiences from the site managers' perspectives, and in this way strengthen the exchange between researchers and site management. Next slide, please. Challenges for maintaining this interface between research, practice, and policy are, for example, that we are working towards Panorama Nature Culture becoming a research database, a resource and learning tool for heritage researchers and practitioners, and for this we need to mainstream the portal. However, the panorama review process does not apply strict scientific standards. It accepts perspectives and beneficiaries without triangulation, for example. At the moment, we request in our review process at least 2 different viewpoints from the Heritage Authority and the locals. Therefore, we need to create specific tools for reviewing, evaluating, and analyzing the data produced by different stakeholders, including the beneficiaries. This is a work in progress for the whole platform, so that we can build evidence based on examples of completed interventions where there is a reliability on the documentation process. Also, Panorama is building tools for capturing the replicability of solutions. Another challenge is the use of indigenous and local knowledge for policy. These processes are already initiated in the context of the IPES on biodiversity and ecosystem services or the IPCC on climate change. However, we still need to explore the use of indigenous and local knowledge for heritage policy development. Another point is that Panorama focuses on sharing success, while we also need to share and learn from unsuccessful examples. Lastly, and most importantly, we need to engage cultural heritage practitioners in the platform, overcome the limits of the solution format, which has been conceived in the nature conservation sector, and the limits in the usage of an online system with issues on internet access and technology constraints. Next slide, please. So, since there might be many cultural heritage professionals in this audience, I would like to take the opportunity to invite you to visit Panorama and explore inspiring nature culture solutions. If you would like to share your story, the solution format and manual for nature culture solution providers is available at this link. And please feel free to contact us at the email above. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maya. And thank you to all our brilliant 3 presenters. We're a little bit adrift on time, so I think what's going to happen now is Tilly is going to step in and explain how we move forward into the groups. And please take your questions, your thoughts, your comments from these provocations into the group work. Tilly, I think you're going to explain what happens next.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And thank you for those presentations. They were fab. They were really great. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move into breakout groups. You'll be automatically assigned to a breakout group. And people who've requested Spanish facilitation will be assigned into a group that will enable that. Do not worry.
Thank you so much, Tilly. We had a really great discussion in our group. I hope everybody else did too. So we're now going to have each group reporting back for about 4, maximum 5 minutes each. And if you could try and summarize what are the key recommendations from your group in terms of policy changes, research priorities, and action priorities, that would be great. So I don't know exactly who all the rapporteurs are, but I would like you to step forward, please, from the first group. I don't know if groups have numbers. Do they have numbers?
Yeah, so if we start with group 1, Tim, I believe you're in group 1. Do you have a rapporteur for your group?
Alice Lyle was volunteered to be our rapporteur. So Alice.
Hi.
Alice.
Hi, everyone. I volunteered / was volunteered. So hopefully I will manage to sort of answer the questions, although I have a lot of notes in not entirely a direct order. So I'll just, so for the first one, how can heritage better contribute to connect social and cultural issues to environmental concerns? I think that we didn't dig into that specifically because it was more a series of people acknowledging that it already does, and it's more a question of recognizing that. It's less that we need to make the connections, it's more that we need to recognize and work with the connections. And there were lots of really interesting comments and examples, so I will try and pull some of these in on the way. But we did, as Helen's actually already said, we did identify on point 3 about what kind of research and practical actions are needed, that right through this there was that notion that we need to break down silos and we need to think differently about what we're doing, not just about connecting things together. There was a great example of discussing water management, water heritage landscapes in India, and the way that aspects of that heritage, both historical and things that are still used today, that it tends to get broken down into the way that we tend to put boundaries around what we're thinking about, looking at things as monuments that stand alone rather than looking at the whole dynamic system, the way that people interact with it and their intangible heritage, and also the watershed and the natural heritage and the standard of the water. And that to do this, you need to stop thinking about things just as commodities, both the water and, from my perspective, I was thinking, actually, we often think of heritage as a commodity as well, instead of as part of people's kind of living world. So, I mean, that's, I guess, both more research into that, but it's also a practical action to do better at it. And I guess that ties into policy change as well, to recognise that we're the best one in the world. Policy tends to separate things up because you have a policy for thing X and you have a policy for thing Y. There's a vital need at two, looking at policy change to build nature conservation into cultural heritage conservation, and just to recognise that these things simply cannot be divided at all. There was a good example from Namibia as well, saying that, you know, people's culture and their livelihoods are not things that we can subdivide into separate sections. And I suppose we need to look at supporting that as well. There was a great research question, I thought, for 3 as well, which I think Anna Tonks brought up, saying when we were talking about Indigenous land management, we also maybe need to think too for other countries where you have, say, a Western context, who are the stewards in that context? Because I think there can be conflict built in there as well between, for instance, farmers feeling they're the stewards, other people feeling that they have an ownership of landscape as well. You know, and what does that mean in, say, recovered landscapes and what used to be industrial landscapes that are now ecological landscapes as well? Who are the stewards of that, and how do you negotiate those relationships? Looking at 4 about what we can do to improve partnerships and collaboration, there's a really good example from Marewen in New Zealand, talking about, as Maori, building advocacy platform to try and deal with the impacts on the community of, I guess, disconnection from your heritage because you don't have ownership of your traditional land, but you're trying to deal with both the impacts on your heritage and also deal with in-community conflict, because some people have been completely alienated from their heritage because of historical colonization. So you need an advocacy platform and to connect up your community, both to handle outside threats, but also to deal with conversations within your community as well, to deal with it. And I thought that's both improving partnerships and collaboration, but also maybe that's something that policy change could support as well, and actually enable that better future. I think one of the presenter said earlier that good Anthropocene, a better future for everybody involved in it. Another interesting comment I thought that probably falls under several of these was talking about when we're talking about the community and we're talking about bottom up or top down. Most people supported bottom up, but some people did note that sometimes you also need that structure and that leadership as well. It's not just a question of sort of throwing it open and saying, go and get on with it. You need to provide people with a framework. But we probably also at times need to recognise that in some places, researchers and scientists might actually be part of the community as well. And that when that point was made, I think it was mainly thinking about people living in the community. But I suspect in some other parts of the world, if you are both you're of an Indigenous background and you live in an area, but you might also be a specialist, a land manager or a researcher, and you're part of that community as well. So you have those different aspects of you that you're bringing to this, which I guess supports session questions 1 through 3, because you are part of that connection. You're maybe driving policy change, doing some of the research, and doing it through partnership and collaboration. I'm sure I've missed some of the really good points that were made because there's far too much to feedback in 5 minutes. So I hope that was a useful summation. And if you were in group 1 and I've missed out something really important or misrepresented you, please let me know and I will send a note afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. That was quite comprehensive, and thank you for addressing the questions. So can we move on to the next group, group 2? I would like to ask the rapporteur to give maximum 5 minutes of the key points and recommendations, please. I didn't actually know which group I was in, but I hope whoever was rapporteur for group 2, is that you, Rosalind?
Yes. Yeah, so, well, no one really volunteered to do the feedback, but I will kind of summarize some of the points, and Stuart took some notes as well, so I think he'll be able to kind of come in and probably pick up the things that I forget. So, no, I want to thank the group for an interesting discussion. So it's kind of more of a kind of collection of thoughts. Maybe some of them are related to the questions, some less so. But we started off kind of thinking about some of the challenges between kind of relating kind of culture and nature. I think we started with an example of water resources and the fact that the natural world can sometimes be characterized by number crunching, and it's important to find ways of kind of connecting meanings to these kind of more kind of numeric objective measures that we tend to take in our management of natural resources. Now, this kind of led on to a discussion about methodologies. From my research perspective, I'm quite interested in understanding different methods to kind of evaluate and elicit like the less tangible kind of aspects of cultural heritage. So we talked a bit about different ways to do this. So we store things like storytelling and allowing communities to really connect with their own memories and experiences of different aspects of natural heritage. So I think that's quite important, and really kind of bringing about a kind of culture of participation in that way. But it's a challenge to capture the nuances that are connected with such complex systems. So we do need kind of a big suite of methods, but these can be quite challenging to implement, on it. It's perhaps okay to use in a big research project, but how do we kind of effectively kind of use these methods to kind of continuously understand the kind of cultural dimensions of some of our big challenges? And we talked about the challenges. We talked a lot about the bottom-up kind of approach as well, and the need to engage communities in quite an open way. And the fact that communities can be left out of decisions, they can be fragmented. There's often very marginalized parts of communities that just simply don't have a voice, and there's not an obvious way to be able to engage them in the discussion. So, how can we reach out and kind of ensure that these people are also engaged in the discussion, so we have a real reflection of what the cultural heritage is in an area? We talked a bit, we asked for some kind of positive examples, and there was a really interesting example. I think it was Guyana, where the local community was involved with working with the Met Office to advise on weather forecasting and kind of incorporating local knowledge into these forecasting systems that would then have implications for agricultural management and flooding management as well. So I think that was a really nice example of where kind of different knowledge bases have been brought together. And it was also raised the challenge of the different indigenous languages when things are expressed in very different ways. And how can you bring the knowledge that's expressed using these very different languages together? So moving on, we also, going back to the methods question a bit, we talked a bit, I mentioned in my project that we're going to be using kind of some quite creative methods to kind of understand cultural narratives. So somebody mentioned a really good example of kind of capturing values towards local species using kind of creative arts-based methods. And I think one of the outputs was producing tea towels that feature stories and the values of these local species. So again, it was the role of storytelling and be able to catch kind of values in that way. I think we talked a bit then about we had a really good example from the city of Glasgow in its role as city of culture, and how they were using kind of culture to kind of connect with the climate emergency and encouraging people to engage with that. And we were then talking about the use of online maps for people to record some of their experiences in relation to that. And then the links between those processes and the city council. And it was nice to see some kind of join up there. So the council was then taking on board some of these experiences from the kind of community in that way. And there was an obligation then to kind of carry out a climate change impact assessment in relation to kind of cultural heritage. Let me check what else I had. I think then we went on to quite an interesting discussion at the end. I mean, Stuart raised the question that I think somebody addressed to me during my presentation about the difference between the issue of colonial heritage and the difference between the global north and the south. And there was a question about, how you would address or use some of the methods that we've been discussing in areas where people have been evicted from basically their cultural homelands, and, how you deal with some of those issues. And again, I think for me, it went back to kind of working, from the bottom up with communities, but we recognize this is a really difficult issue I'm not sure we had so much experience in our group about how we kind of address some of these more colonial issues and the need for different approaches in different countries. We had people giving us examples from all over the world, but we weren't really able to disentangle kind of, how we kind of, use different approaches in different place and recognize some of these dynamics that have happened in history. And finally, that led on to a question about negative heritage. And, to what extent do we record kind of positive heritage stories? And to what extent do we look at negative heritage and recognize it in all its forms? It's important, I think, to be transparent about the different heritages, but there's also kind of, how much do we want to give voice to kind of some of the more negative histories in terms of hatred and things like this. So we ended with a research question about kind of what are the forms of heritage and who decides what they are and who decides kind of what we do about it and the research questions that we ask. So Stuart may have some more points.
Thank you so much. I don't think we have time.
Sorry,
because you've used 6 minutes. But so I'm going to move on now to the next group, which is Nicole Franceschini.
Yes, that's me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, to compliment the entire group, because I think it was a great conversation and it was great to learn from one another. We had examples from Bulgaria, China, Greece, Italy, India, Peru, Mexico, and South Korea. So a lot of very different examples ranging from archaeological management to the management of religious places to intangible heritage and performances. We focus mostly on 2 questions, looking at the connection between heritage, so the practice, and academia, and how to engage with communities. In connection to the connection between academia and practitioners, the one thing that came out from the conversation was that there's the need to work better together. So to work together between academics and practitioners to explore more effective participatory and holistic approaches, to really find some hybrid and effective methods to bring together social sciences, environmental sciences, and humanities to actually offer better means of engagement and better means of participation. Last but not least, another important element that came out specifically on the discussion on heritage and academia was the need to strengthen the understanding of the interdependencies and the dynamics between nature and culture, particularly looking at the knowledge and expertise of people and communities. So something where, because there is this knowledge embedded in places, it's important that we reach out to places to actually embed this knowledge into academia. On the how to engage with communities, a strong point that was made was actually the need to build trust, to actually create means to have community trusting the practitioner. So not to engage in a paternalistic or in a patronizing way, but to actually create a joint platform where we interact with community as practitioners, or community interact with practitioner and with academia as at a peer level. So at being all together and being all together in this research and in this work we're doing, which also brought the attention to the changing figures of practitioners and the changing needs of academia, particularly looking at practitioners becoming more facilitators rather than that idea of expertise and expert-driven processes. We also seen opportunities, and this came from our 2 colleagues from China and Bulgaria, of actually place-based performances and putting intangible traditions directly in connection with the places where they're born and with the places, especially the natural places they belong to, as a mean not only of connecting people to heritage or actually embedding everything together, but also as means for what could be economic development, resilience within communities, and different elements, not only looking at, for example, tourism development. In fact, our colleague from Greece brought forward the fact that tourism can be a really big challenge for communities if people and communities are not ready to actually open up to this. Last but not least, we identified 3 challenges. One of the challenge that was brought to us by our colleague from India was, how do we best engage with communities in rapidly changing demographics in a city like New Delhi, where communities keep on changing, where there's a lot of demographics that actually takes different shapes over years. how do we best engage with them? The need to actually work on the institutional divide and the administrative divide. More often, it's common that actually you have either two ministries or two different agencies that don't communicate with one another. And this divide actually makes also the work on the ground much more challenging. Last but not least, one of the challenges that was identified was different languages, not only the actual languages that we speak, but also that institutional language versus the language we speak, that at times seems to be unbridgeable, and it really makes the work very, very difficult. Also, you know, the languages we use in academia with the languages practitioners use, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicole. So that was another great and very rich discussion you've had. Now, I think we're on group number 3, or is it number 4? Number 4. So I'm not sure if that was me or was I in group 5? Tilly, would you enlighten me, please?
So you were in number 5. So I think, Clara, if you're okay to feedback for your group, please, that would be fabulous.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Our group was the focus was slightly narrower, and there were not that many contributions. A few of us contributed and the others were listening. I hope they can come back through chat line or whatever to fill the gaps that I leave. The focus is, you know, how can heritage better contribute to connect social and cultural issues to environmental concerns? That was the first question. And we looked at the disconnect between the different groups, in particular the local communities, the traditional communities, or those who are indigenous communities, whatever, and the academic communities. There is the polarization. One example given was, you know, it is driven by research money. Sometimes you already create a research project and then you plonk it within the community to identify what are the issues. Some of the suggestion for improvement was that couldn't we develop research facilities, research skills within those communities that are looking after the land, that are looking after the environment, who are already in tune with the traditional practices and the way they protect the environment. Why can't we have researchers trained up, academic institutions within that kind of community environment, rather than taking somebody from an institution and, you know, parachuting them into that environment? So that was quite important, that the future must be the way we look at research and policy making in terms of environmental issues. We need to develop those localized skills, localized knowledge-based skills. There's a closer connect. That was one of the issues that we discussed. And, you know, some of the issues that other people have brought up, like the kind of language we use and the way we treat local communities that we want to study as case studies. They're always case studies, they're always evidence, but never the people who lead and make those changes. That was important. And those issues can be translated to urban environment too. We had an example about a river project. One of the participants raised, you know, how important it is. And the pandemic has brought it to the forefront, you know, how memory, knowledge is being lost, intangible cultural spaces are being lost because they're no longer used, and they're going, and practices, you know, people are forgetting practices as well. So that it's not just about rural. Whenever we talk about environmental issues, immediately the mind goes to the rural sector or the local community, the indigenous community. But urban settings are beginning to struggle with those sort of issues too. I think that's broadly what we looked at. The future needs to be the bridging of the connection between research frameworks and local people. How do we bring that together and create research academic environment within local communities?
Thank you so much, Clara. I've been hearing a very, very strong emphasis from all of you on the critical importance of community participation. And that applies, I think, to research and also to policy and to practice, I think I just need to now share the key points from the working group that I facilitated. And in the meantime, I've been reminded to ask people to please do share practical examples on the chat. So in our group, we started by talking about the challenge that heritage it needs to change, cultural and natural heritage is changing. And then at what point does it then stop becoming heritage? That was a question that UNESCO was asked to answer. And we discussed how the evolution of heritage to some extent is necessary for it to survive in a changing world. We talked about the risks of tourism, but also the importance of tourism, not only for communities to be able to make a living in rural areas based on sustaining heritage, but also as a way of reviving pride and recognition of the importance of that heritage amongst communities and amongst national and local populations that are increasingly forming the tourists rather than international, particularly in the context of COVID. We talked about how the importance of local traditional knowledge and Indigenous peoples' control for both natural and cultural heritage conservation, and that the cultural heritage sector has come a long way, but there are still some real challenges in terms of local participation. And in 2001, an Indigenous council was proposed at the World Heritage Committee to advise the committee, but that idea was turned down. So we were thinking that could be a policy suggestion, a recommendation to revive that committee to strengthen the linkages between culture and nature in the World Heritage Convention. We talked about the issue that's come up in other presentations, how the national institutions dealing with culture and nature are really still very separate, still very siloed. And that is a real challenge in making these linkages between culture and nature. For example, in Kenya, the National Museums of Kenya and the Kenya Forestry Service both are meant to be supporting conservation of Kaya sacred forests, but the lack of coordination between them is a real hindrance to that goal. We talked about examples of in the Andes, how important it is to look at Indigenous people's own worldviews and how they link nature, culture, ancestors, sacred beliefs, the souls of people coming from nature and being linked, going back to nature, and how these Indigenous worldviews are actually so important to understand the connections between nature and culture. And the need to really do more research on those worldviews. There has been some understanding and some research in Latin America, but probably less in Africa and Asia. And then finally, on the question of collaboration, there was the point was made that actually learning exchanges between indigenous communities themselves can be really, really valuable. That Michigenda from coastal Kenya visited the potato park in Peru, and then that really inspired them to be much more active in conserving their kaya forests and their cultural heritage, and inspired them to establish a similar biocultural heritage territory, just like the potato park in Peru, but adapted to the kaya forest landscape and led by indigenous peoples' values and worldviews. So I'll stop there because I'm conscious that it's already 2:00. It's quite difficult to summarize all this. I mean, I think we've heard a lot about the challenges in the heritage and cultural heritage sector and the efforts that have been made to improve integration of nature and strong participation of local communities as part of that. And in terms of recommendations, some of the ones that have come up again and again for policy are relating to having a more holistic framework. And in fact, in our group, there was a request to UNESCO to provide guidance that is integrating cultural heritage, natural heritage, and sustainable development challenges, practical guidance that can be more holistic in terms of addressing those interlinked dimensions. I think we didn't talk so much about the biodiversity sector, but I highlighted in our group that there is actually also a real need to promote greater integration of traditional knowledge and indigenous people's participation in biodiversity conservation efforts. We have the Global Biodiversity Framework post-2020 targets, but traditional knowledge and indigenous people's rights are only mentioned in 2 targets. And the framework is very much driven by national governments' perspectives and scientific approaches. So I think there's a lot that can be done to build on our successes, both within the cultural heritage community to integrate nature and within the natural heritage and biodiversity community to integrate culture. And I hope the report of this workshop will provide these concrete recommendations from the groups and do a better synthesis than I can do right now. But I'm going to hand over to Tim Badman, if you'd like to highlight a few points of conclusions that you've coming from this session. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Christina. Thanks to everyone. I guess we're getting to the close of 2 hours, and the first conclusion is we needed about 3, I think, to do justice to this today. But I think this is a meeting that's part of, I think, the need to really build a much larger set of partnerships and movement around the issues that we're addressing here. And I think we've touched both on the places where we could see change. I think there's an enormous amount that UNESCO and IUCN and ICOMOS and ICCROM and IAED and international organizations could do to really join up our efforts more in this space. I think we tend to not think enough about how we just organize collaboration to make things simpler, to sort of channel our energies into some common goals. But I think there's actually a lot of movement in that space right now, and I think we could really be getting somewhere ambitious much faster if we put our joint energies together. I think one of the paradoxes, though, is that what comes out of this for me, above all, as somebody that came from where working where I'm from and where I was born on a World Heritage Site to working in IUCN, is that really it's the diversity of what happens on the ground that really makes a difference. And so trying to find a way to engage with the diversity of local experiences and to find a way to do that in a way which really engages in diversity. It doesn't sort of come up with a a homogenized prescription for everywhere, but that tries to move us progressively sort of forward together at the level of places and landscapes, and that means some really quite different approaches. I'm very happy, I guess, from today to have so many comments focusing on language as an English Anglophone in an event hosted in the UK. It's such a problem in terms of so many of the international practices that have been socialized at so many levels, that it's been done through so few languages, and how concepts have become embedded in a lot of ways we talk about practice that just don't make sense to large to the majority of places on the ground. If you just look at World Heritage that I work in, it works through English and French, but maybe 9 out of 10 of the places that are engaging in World Heritage don't work in either of those languages. And language, is the front end of so many things that unpack into the different ways and the diversity of ways that humanity connects with nature, and how over time, we've either lost some of those connections, or the system sort of pushes against rather than towards supporting those connections. So I'm very happy to see that sort of recognition of the importance of rethinking landscape, the importance of supporting local leadership. I was very happy to hear the word advocacy used quite a lot as well, because I think this is a space where we need to, make the case and make a bigger case, not amongst those of us that I guess are sort of working to support the connection to nature and culture, but to turn these ideas into, into a story that really gets into the mainstream bloodstream of conservation practice, and to come back to the opening, I think the concept of virtuous circles is actually something which we should maybe think about, because I think there's a way to really sort of break into this this conversation where we will start to see that the connection of nature and culture and the empowerment of local action leads to better results, that then reinforces that is a good strategy, and that's a strategy that can be transformative. So I think with that we're well over time, but thanks for the opportunity to join today. Thanks to the organisers, and thanks to everybody that's participated. I can speak, at least for my bit of IUCN, the World Heritage Programme, and our Nature Culture Initiative, to say we'll be delighted to engage in the actions that we hope will come from this event and roll forward, and look forward to staying in touch with all of you as we get somewhere better in the years ahead. So thanks very much. And Christina, we give it back to you for the last word, I think.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that great summary. Definitely, we need to work more closely together. IIED is very committed to do so. So really pleased to have connected with you and to so many wonderful people through this conference. So we're now 10 minutes over time. So I'd just like to thank you very much for your active participation, your great ideas and contributions. And I will hand over to Francesca for the final word. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. And thank you, everybody, again, for all your wonderful contribution today. And I really just say a few words to remind you that we are continuing the discussion today, this afternoon, UK time, with a session on heritage, disaster response and resilience, chaired by Rohit Jigwatsu. It's starting at 3 p.m. UK time, and we hope to see you there. So thank you very much again, everybody, and see you in the next sessions. Bye.